The Soviet Union's in political and economic turmoil. On Sunday, all the republics vote for unity or independence. Reveille at a Red Army barracks in Minsk, a new day for the world's largest military force. 3.5 million men, the majority of them conscripts. Today there's enormous debate within the armed services about the way they're being used at home by the Soviet leadership. As economic and political chaos spreads, serving officers disagree about the role of the Red Army.
In my opinion, the army is today the only mechanism of power, of state power, that is holding our country back from slipping into the chaos of civil war.
Decent officers, warrant officers, privates and sergeants all feel they have the blood of innocent people on their hands and understand that they have been used as pawns in a vast political game.
But it's no game for President Gorbachev because at stake is the future shape and size of the country. The Union of Soviet Republics forged together over 70 years is cracking apart. Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania have already voted overwhelmingly for independence. On Sunday, each of the 15 republics will take part in a national referendum to stay with Moscow or break away. 100 miles away is the infantry division at Minsk. There are some 50 different nationalities here. The Red Army is often called the school of the USSR, teaching young men from all over the country to be good Soviets. But events in Vilnius damage that reputation.
You know, it just makes one sick at heart. Not just on my account, but on behalf of all the people who were there at the time. Such actions will simply widen the gulf between the army and the people. They'll realize that the army is no longer their defender, but their enemy. An army to fight its own people. Whereas our slogan is, the people and the army are one.
In Vilnius, that slogan must ring very hollow. The television tower where so many died at the hands of the army has become a place of pilgrimage. School children from all over Lithuania are brought here every day for a lesson in recent history. Revulsion at what happened here has affected not only Lithuanians, but also many soldiers. The paratroopers who opened fire were outsiders, drafted in from hundreds of miles away. It was the men based here who were most sickened at the idea of attacking their own people and could not bring themselves to take part. This officer could face court-martial because he and about 20 others disobeyed orders.
They resorted to passive resistance. Our unit was put on red alert, and all the officers were supposed to be at home waiting for the CO's order. Some of our officers said they were ill. Some officers went into hiding in the homes of their civilian friends and acquaintances. As for me, I went to stay with friends.
What rank of officer are we talking about who refused to obey orders?
Some were majors, like me. Some were junior. Some were senior. The highest rank was a colonel. Even soldiers who spent as little as 6 months here in Vilnius, in Lithuania, realize that the locals are not wild animals. They're not wolves. They aren't bloodthirsty. You might be able to deceive someone who's come here from a long way off by telling him that the place is inhabited only by fascists and nationalists. A man who has lived here and spent time with the people can't be deceived.
So if the army tried to involve the local garrison here in events similar to those in January, what would happen?
I think that the orders might be openly disobeyed.
And what proportion of the armed forces here would take that attitude?
So far as the rank and file are concerned, I can't give you an exact figure. As for the officers, about a third would immediately refuse to obey.
For officers at Minsk not involved in any civil unrest, events in Vilnius highlight a dilemma. The Red Army doesn't know who it's 1/3 of the officers here served in Afghanistan and Eastern Europe, where they knew their enemy. They were safeguarding communism and defending the motherland. But since then, the military's been involved in bloody confrontations with its own citizens. In April 1989, troops killed 20 people in the Georgian capital Tbilisi. Last year, 83 died in Baku, capital of Azerbaijan, when the army smashed down roadblocks. And in January, soldiers killed at least 20 people in the Baltic republics. Officers here regard those as 3 dreadful mistakes.
A fourth mistake would be a final blow to the authority of the army. A fourth mistake would be the beginning of the collapse of the army. If there was a fourth mistake, it could be said to be the collapse of our state. If there is no army, there is no state. I don't think that our politicians will make a fourth mistake. Otherwise, the army and the people won't understand them. He who cannot govern the state, those who cannot control the army, should step down.
Perestroika has brought an openness to the Red Army, and it's the young officers who are speaking out. The military is their future. They take a professional pride in being soldiers and don't want to be involved in domestic politics. They feel to be dragged into another civilian conflict would split their loyalties, and some would disobey orders.
Поэтому, может, старая часть пойдет.
So it is possible that the old guard will go along with it. Others will hesitate, and another group will simply keep out of it and not go anywhere.
Останется в стороне. Каждый уже мыслит по-своему.
Each person thinks for himself. We have been permitted a kind of freedom of thought.
Нас в рамки не ставят. Если раньше их ставили в рамки, КПСС ставила в рамки.
For that reason, our thinking is no longer straitjacketed, whereas before it used to be restricted by the Communist Party or the government. But that is a thing of the past.
The square in front of the Lithuanian Parliament building in Vilnius is where rejection of the Red Army as an occupying force is most apparent. A wall of concrete protects the Parliament, decorated with gestures of protest. A former paratrooper is one of hundreds of people to come here with his military badges and documents and impale them on the spikes of the barricades.
I really felt terrible. I was ashamed that I was a paratrooper. This is my protest against the occupational army.
But if the Red Army was to come back, what would you do?
We will never use any weapons. Our weapon is hope in victory. Of course, the army is much stronger, but our people are together, they are united, and we will be free.
People arrived all the time to add their medals to the collection already nailed to a wooden scaffold. Decorations awarded for good conduct or long service. It was February the 23rd, a poignant date to demonstrate. In the Soviet Union, it is Army Day, and everywhere else in the country, people were honouring the achievements of the Red Army. In Vilnius, there are no public celebrations for Army Day, only continued mourning for what the Red Army has done here. In previous years, on Soviet holidays, soldiers would march down this street past the Lithuanian Parliament building. This year, their way is blocked. Instead, a rally was organised by Interfront, a political group which represents the local Communist Party and supports the rights of the 20% of the population who are Russian, not Lithuanian. Speakers said on Army Day they should give thanks to the military for protecting them and not listen to the nationalists who provoked confrontation with the troops. The general officials who represent the old guard blame Gorbachev for allowing the political turmoil to develop, then using the soldiers to crack down.
When the situation is not stable, and when extremists and nationalists are fighting, the army has to come and protect the people. We cannot just watch civilians dying. Then the army has to interfere and to make sure the people are protected from killings. But when people are dead, usually the army is blamed.
Will the time come when the army loses patience with Gorbachev and says, if you can't restore order, we will?
Everything can happen in life.
Could that happen?
I can't guess. I don't want to guess. But anything can happen.
The regiment at Minsk echoes the discontent felt throughout the ranks, that while the Red Army is being cut back all the time, they're also being made to do the politicians' dirty work. The army was 5 million strong in 1988. It will end up half that size if the defence budget is slashed as expected. There are economies everywhere, using simulators rather than tanks for target practice.
We're not thinking about real enemies. We're not imagining the Americans or the British. We don't see the enemy in front of us. Driving's just like mastering our profession.
Can you imagine being asked to do that job in peacetime, for instance in Vilnius or Riga?
Yes, we can. In Vilnius, tanks and armoured personnel carriers were used not to kill the people, but just to defend ourselves. We used them as a kind of shield against the people with aggressive attitudes to the army.
But a woman was crushed to death under a tank.
I think that was accidental. A woman dying. Because accidents like that did take place.
Do you think the army should ever be used in those kind of situations?
What is happening in Vilnius, we think should have been coped with by the police without the army's interference.
Yet when the order comes, you would all go, wouldn't you?
If the order were to come, of course. We always carry out orders.
Always?
Always. Of course.
But thousands have disobeyed the military's first command and refused to answer the call-up. In the Baltic republics, it was 90%. Those Lithuanians who did join up now find their feelings divided between their uniform and their homeland.
It's painful to watch as your people are being killed, if things are going too far.
How many of your friends refused to serve in the army or ran away from the call-up?
In the training unit where I was conscripted to, definitely 10 men escaped, and many more left after the troubles began in Lithuania.
So did you have to think very hard about staying in the Red Army?
We thought Lithuania might split away and then there'd be a Lithuanian army and we might be sent home to serve in it.
After all, everybody wants to serve one's own nation.
Lithuania was an independent country for 20 years with its own defence force, crushed when the Soviets took over in 1940. As it struggles to break free again, the parliament has become a sanctuary for young draft dodgers.
If they catch me and take me somewhere, as a Lithuanian citizen, I will refuse to take the oath and will try to escape from the army.
Would you ever consider taking direct action against the Red Army here in Lithuania?
Now there's no necessity. But if the situation changes, if we have a partisan war here, then of course I'll do it.
The weapons for a civil war are already stockpiled, most bought illegally from the Red Army. It's a poor reflection on morale that soldiers will steal guns and sell them. £300 for a Malakoff pistol, £700 for a Kalashnikov rifle. The weapons are there and so is the emotion.
To me, the Red Army is the army which killed my grandfather, who sent my father to prison and who had people killed in Lithuania. To me, this is the army of killers and occupiers here in Lithuania.
A new Lithuanian defence force is now being formed. 85% are draft dodgers, the others ex-Red Army, putting their training to good use in the nationalist cause. Officially, they have no weapons, just a determination to protect their country. As Army Day drew to a close in Vilnius, Lithuanians gathered in the square, a peaceful display of patriotism to match the Interfront rally. They didn't realise there was something to thank the military for after all. Only now has it emerged that thousands of soldiers earmarked to quell the unrest here refuse to come. Paratroopers in Vitebsk, battle-hardened from Afghanistan, were insulted at being put under KGB control and asked to confront civilians in Vilnius. They wouldn't go. News of the revolt was publicised by an unofficial soldiers' trade union called SHIELD. They leafleted 20,000 troops saying, "Copy Vitebsk. Does courage mean crushing innocent people under tanks? Refuse to obey unconstitutional orders to shoot unarmed people."
The Vitebsk division has a rich tradition rooted in the paratroop units, which are still under the Ministry of Defence. They continue to think of themselves as officers of the army, and they refuse to recognise that they belong to the KGB. The army realises more and more that it must not participate in political games. There should be no question. The army must defend its motherland, the country's independence, and not carry out the will of one party or another, even the Communist Party.
But in Latvia, the army is openly involved in politics. In the centre of Riga, a statue from the time Latvia, like Lithuania, was an independent country. Beneath it, another memorial. Every day the snow is carefully cleared away. Nothing must obscure the memory of the 6 people who died in demonstrations here in late January, just a week after the killings in Vilnius. Service families claim there's strong prejudice against them from the local Latvian population, particularly over housing. Inessa's husband is a major. One room is all they have to live and sleep in, and they've spent 14 years of married life in a shared flat. A second room only became free, says Inessa, because the officer living there was beaten up by Latvian nationalists and invalided out of the army. At least their daughter now has some privacy. 3 families have to use one toilet. 5 adults and 2 children share the shower. Inessa accuses the nationalist politicians of deliberately discriminating against army families by passing laws which deprive them of the chance of permanent homes. And a growing number of officers are now campaigning for soldiers' rights.
The situation is very upsetting because we're talking about people who have done their honest duty to their motherland. Nobody chooses the place where he will perform his military service. He just ends up where he's sent, doesn't he? And if he ends up in a situation where people say to him, "Go home, occupying troops," of course it's very upsetting for people to meet that attitude on all sides.
Latvia, Lithuania and Estonia have already voted for independence. If on Sunday in the national referendum other republics do the same, then the hostility towards the troops, the accusation that they're an army of occupation, will grow. And the argument within the military about its own role at home will intensify.
Whatever the outcome, the referendum will be a highly explosive factor. Attempts will be made by all sorts to use it in this way and that, in their own interests, principally by the leaders of our party, the Communist Party. We're hoping that political nerve and common sense will prevail over both right and left wingers, and that the result of the referendum will not blow society up from inside.
It seems President Gorbachev is satisfying no one, least of all the high-profile army men in Moscow who are also politicians. The more liberal generals criticize Gorbachev for being too heavy-handed.
I think that, most unfortunately, attempts to use the army to solve political problems for political purposes are totally unjustified. I think that Gorbachev will go down in history as a tragic figure. He had the chance to go down as one of the very greatest of reformers, but I think he's turned out to be incapable of reform.
On the other side, officers like Viktor Alksnis, known as the Black Colonel. He accuses Gorbachev of not being tough enough and leaving the army to sort out the country's problems.
It isn't the first time that the army's been used to carry the can for the miscalculations of the politicians. The army ends up being the scapegoat for all the trouble arising from political mistakes. What happened in the Baltic republics took place with the sanction of the senior political circles of our country, and the Gorbachev was aware of everything that took place.
Could the time come where senior members of the army say to Gorbachev, enough, we will not be involved anymore?
No. I don't see any chance of that happening within the senior ranks of the army, but I can't rule out the possibility of it happening within the lower ranks. The situation should never arise when the army is forced to come out against its own supreme commander. If the supreme commander doesn't carry out his functions and obligations, it'd be better if he stood down voluntarily.
Whatever happens in Sunday's vote, Gorbachev can't hold the country together by force. That could provoke the revolution in the ranks.